This is a production of Cornell University.
Welcome to all of you, and welcome to Professor Francis Fukuyama back to Cornell. My name is Nick Vanderwall. I'm the director of the Einaudi Center, and the talk today is in the context of our Distinguished Speaker Series, which has for the last 2 years been a component of the Einaudi Center's foreign policy initiative. The objective of the foreign policy initiative in general is to bring to campus a more prominent discussion of contemporary foreign policy issues and international affairs. We're very grateful to the Einaudi family for support of this initiative, as well as to the Kessler family and their gift last year. The Distinguished Speaker Series brings to campus different viewpoints on contemporary international politics and economics from noted experts, both from the academic world and the policy world. The current theme for this spring and next fall is American foreign policy in an election year and the legacy of the Bush administration and sort of issues for the next administration in the area of foreign policy. We've had a number of important speakers on this topic already. Many of you I recognize from last week's talk by General Zinni. Let me announce several upcoming speakers before presenting today's speaker. On September 17th, Professor Stephen Krasner of the Graham Stewart Professor of International Relations at Stanford University and someone who spent time working as a special advisor to Condoleezza Rice will be on campus to address this general theme. In November, the date hasn't been set yet, Nancy Birdsall, the current director of the Center for Global Development, will be here to talk about prospects for the new administration on vis-a-vis the developing world. Let me also say that we're planning a debate on the future of U.S. involvement in Iraq. We're looking at a potential date in early October. We haven't set that provisionally right now, October 7th. I hope to be able to say much more about this soon. Let me also say that the Bartels Fellow planned for next fall is Louise Arbour, the current UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and we're also about to set a date for that. So let me present today's speaker. Francis Fukuyama is one of the most influential scholars on American foreign policy, who is also happens to be a Cornell alumni. Class of 74. Class of 74. I thought he was a government major, but in fact he was a classics major. Professor Fukuyama is the Bernard Schwartz Professor of International Political Economy at the Paul Nitze School of Advanced International Studies of Johns Hopkins University in Washington, and he's currently the director of SAIS's International Development Program. He's written extremely widely on a number of issues relating to political and economic development, from U.S. foreign policy to social capital issues, state building, and even bioethics. His best work, I would say, is The End of History and the Last Man, which was published in 1992 and has appeared in over 20 foreign editions. It has won a number of prizes. His most recent book, America at the Crossroads, Democracy, Power, and the Neoconservative Legacy, was published by Yale University Press in March 2006. He is also the chairman of the editorial board of a brand new magazine, of a new magazine called The American Interest. Professor Fukuyama received his BA from Cornell University in Classics. He has a PhD from Harvard in political science, and he also holds honorary doctorates from Connecticut College and Doane College. He's, in addition to working at SAIS, he has worked for several stints at the Rand Corporation, at the State Department, and between 2001 and 2005, he served as a member of the President's Council on Bioethics. He's a member of a number of advisory boards, including the National Endowment for Democracy, the Journal of Democracy, and the New American Foundation. The title of his talk today is American Foreign Policy After the Bush Administration. Please join me in welcoming Professor Fukuyama.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the invitation I got from Professor Van de Waal to come back to Cornell. I was here from 1970 to 1974. I arrived right in the middle of the Vietnam War, a year after the big Cornell crisis, in which Time magazine featured a number of Cornell undergraduates with bandoliers of ammunition around their necks taking over Willard Straight Hall. And so here we are 37 years later, and we're still in a war, an ill-conceived war. But I must say I have not seen a single armed student in my so far this afternoon. So I guess there is progress. There is progress after all. I'm going to talk about. It's necessarily going to have to dwell a bit on the Bush legacy, but. We are in an election campaign. I do presume that at some point the Democrats will make up their mind as to who their candidate's going to be, and we will, I'm quite certain, have a new president starting in January 2009, and therefore we are at a pretty important decision point with regard to the choices made in American foreign policy. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the ideas that have animated foreign policy in recent years, and then really how reality has or has not coincided with those ideas. And that sets the stage for looking ahead to the kinds of shifts that I think will be necessary, the kinds of adjustments that the new president will have to make as we proceed into the next administration. The Bush Doctrine was actually a fairly coherent set of ideas. A lot of my neoconservative friends, I think, played an important role in shaping that strategy. I would summarize it very simply as containing four elements: a very dire threat assessment of what would happen as a result of international terrorism following the September 11th attacks, a doctrine of preemption to deal with the problem of terrorism. Third, a willingness, the nice way of putting it is to exercise American leadership. The less nice way is American unilateralism in working with allies in dealing with the threat. And then finally, the strategic use of democracy promotion as a means of getting at the purported underlying causes of the terrorist problem. And it was actually stated on quite a number of occasions by the president, by the vice president, by various members of the administration, and it formed the coherent strategy for the first 4 years. Now, the problem was that I believe the world is actually quite different, and the assumptions, the going-in assumptions that animated that strategy actually are not suitable to the world that has actually emerged in the early 21st century. And a lot of it has to do with the inapplicability of traditional hard power, that is to say military power, to achieve the kinds of political objectives that the United States seeks in a certain important part of the world. And I think that you can, one good way of thinking about this is just to consider Iraq itself. Today, the United States spends as much on its defense budget as the whole rest of the world combined. It's a huge disproportion, and in terms of lift and technology and communications and firepower, the United States military has historically, it has really no rivals whatsoever. And yet, Iraq, a small country of about 24 million people, after 5 years of American occupation, is still not stabilized. And so, it's an interesting question why this concentration of modern technology and military power is not able to achieve a relatively straightforward goal in a relatively small country. And the reason that it isn't, I believe, has to do with the fact that we are living in a weak state world that is very different from the kind of strong state world that we are used to thinking about in terms of 20th century politics. If you take a standard international relations course, it's all about the interaction of strong centralized states, and the kind of politics that we dealt with in the 20th century with Nazi Germany or Stalin's Russia or the former Soviet Union, Imperial Japan, were all modern centralized states that could enforce rules on their own territory. And in that kind of a world, the classic instruments of foreign policy worked, and primarily the instrument of hard military power. And therefore, if you were attacked by another state and you got them to sign a surrender instrument on the deck of a battleship, that was it. The country surrendered and the war was over, and you could then proceed to kind of rearrange the strategic pieces on the chessboard, understanding that most of those chess pieces were under the control of relatively coherent forms of political authority. In the greater Middle East, which I would define as beginning in North Africa, extending through much of sub-Saharan Africa, through the Middle East proper, much of Central Asia and South Asia up until the border of India, is characterized by weak and sometimes failing states. And in that kind of world, traditional hard power simply does not work as well. It doesn't work as well because without coherent states in places like Afghanistan, Somalia, Palestine, Gaza, largely ungoverned territories, much of sub-Saharan Africa, especially during the 1990s, was characterized by the collapse of state authority, and that whole region, I think, is broadly speaking governed by relatively weak states. The use of hard military power simply does not have the kind of political effect because you cannot deter or coerce or compel states to act on the actors that operate out of their territory. Lebanon is a really good example of that, Hezbollah. And in fact, Henry Kissinger, after the 2006 Lebanon war, wrote an article where, and it kind of illustrates the shift in international relations, because Kissinger comes out of that traditional 20th century world. But he says, okay, Hezbollah is in fact a metastasization of the al-Qaeda pattern. It acts openly as a state within a state, a non-state entity on the soil of a state with all the attributes of a state and backed by a major regional power is a new thing in international politics. Well, it may have been news to Henry Kissinger, but if you had been following African politics over the past couple of decades, you would understand that this is exactly the kind of world that has been emerging in that part of the globe. And it is particularly difficult for American foreign policy because we have a tremendous hard power machine that we want to use to solve the problems. And as they say, when your main tool is a hammer, most of the problems end up looking like nails. And I think that that's one of the difficulties we had in approaching Iraq, that we thought we could solve certain basic political problems through the use of hard power without recognizing that the reconstruction of political authority was central to the aims that we wanted to achieve, and that we did not really have the tools to do that. And so that's why I think in this part of the world you're going to have to use different kinds of instruments. We've made the beginnings of an adjustment already in Iraq, where we've realized that this is a genuine counterinsurgency war. And in this kind of a struggle, the overuse of hard power is almost always counterproductive, because the central struggle is really, there are really bad guys out there that have to be killed, captured, or neutralized, but they're swimming in much larger populations of people that are potentially enemies, potentially friends, or potentially undecided. And if you do not wage a political struggle for the hearts and minds of those broader populations, you are going to lose the broader struggle. And so it really requires a very different set of policy instruments to deal in that kind of world. All right, so I'm actually going to spend the second half of the talk talking about East Asia, and I believe that East Asia does not follow this model. Japan, China, Korea, the states of Southeast Asia are all classic, centralized, relatively strong states with a couple of exceptions. And I think the old rules apply much better in that part of the world. But let's just stick with the broader Middle East initially. Now, I think that we have been dealing in this world for some time, and we should have learned several important lessons about the way that politics operates in the broader Middle East. And the lessons affect every single one of those four elements of the Bush Doctrine that I just mentioned: the threat, preemption, unilateralism, and democracy. So let's begin with the terrorist threat. The administration after September 11th took an extremely dire view of the threat posed by radical Islamism. President Bush has compared the struggle that we are currently involved in to the struggles against Hitler's Germany or global communism, and there's been talk about World War IV and the like. And I think that one of the problems is that fundamental analysis of how deep and dangerous the threat was considerably overstated. Of course, it's easier to say that after 6 years since September 11th, when there hasn't even been a truck bomb or a suicide vest, being used on the territory of the United States. But I think that, the more we understand about that threat, the more we realize that it was not an existential threat for the future, or struggle over the future of Western civilization, but that actually Osama bin Laden, happened to get pretty lucky on September 11th, and the ability to inflict that kind of catastrophic harm on the United States is actually more limited, much more limited than we thought earlier in that period. There was a discussion about the nature of the threat that got truncated too early. Right after September 11th, everybody asked this question, well, why do they hate us? They being the people that had perpetrated the September 11th attacks. And there were two answers that were given. One was that they hate us for who we are. That is to say, they have this fundamental hatred of Western values, and that's what this struggle is all about. And the other was that they just don't like American foreign policy or things that we do in the short run. And I think that the answer to the question, the one that President Bush finally chose was answer A, that they hate us, and he said this in speeches on a number of occasions, that the terrorists hate freedom and that this is a fundamental fight over freedom. But the problem is that the answer to this question depends on who the antecedent of the they is. If the they is the actual Al-Qaeda jihadists that organized September 11th and all of the other attacks since then, that's probably a fair assessment. But if the they refers to the broader Arab and Muslim populations in countries of the broader Middle East, then the answer is really not so clear. And I think there's a fair amount of evidence that indicates that the abysmally low popularity ratings of the United States in that region actually do not arise from the fact that large numbers of people in that part of the world hate American values, but rather, and I think this is demonstrated by poll after poll, they actually don't like American foreign policy. I mean, they don't like the fact that we invaded Iraq. They don't like what they regard as our one-sided support for Israel. They don't like basing, American forces in the Persian Gulf. There are all sorts of things that they're unhappy about, but it does not come down to a fundamental clash of values for those broader populations in the region. And therefore it, I think, reinforces the contention that in a certain sense the anti-Americanism that's been generated in that part of the world can be dealt with, most effectively obviously you've got to kill, capture, neutralize the people that genuinely hate freedom, and there are really people out there for whom this is true. But again, you are dealing in this broader world where your behavior in the short run will very much affect the willingness of the broader populations to help or support the really hardcore and very dangerous people. So again, the hearts and minds component of dealing with this threat is very important, to treat it as primarily a war that is fought through military means. Obviously we're doing that now because we've gotten into Iraq and Afghanistan, but on the assumption that we don't invade and occupy any further countries, the war on terrorism is really going to look like a police and an intelligence operation and really not like a war. Now, the second lesson I would draw from the past few years is that preventive war cannot be the basis of American non-proliferation policy. The Bush Doctrine emphasized preemption in actually a perfectly logical manner. They said, okay, they attacked us on September 11th. This is a stateless group. You cannot use deterrence and containment to deal with this kind of a threat because they have no return address. And therefore, the tools that we used during the Cold War are not adequate You have to go out and get them before they get you. And that logic, I think, is pretty iron tight. They the United States invaded Afghanistan on that ground to, stop these people that had attacked us once and would attack us again. And I think everybody pretty much accepted the legitimacy of that type of preemption. Problem was that this tool of preemption was then used for a different policy purpose, which was to deal with a different but less difficult foreign policy problem, which was the rogue state proliferation problem. It's it's potentially more dangerous because you are talking about nuclear proliferation, but in a certain sense, because the potential proliferators, the famous axis of evil, Iraq, Iran, and North Korea, are states, they are, in my view, susceptible to the kind of deterrence calculation, even if their foreign policies in many respects seem, pretty crazy. I think that states really have a very different calculus when it comes to the use of nuclear weapons. But the rogue state problem and the Al-Qaeda terrorist problem were all mushed together into a single kind of inchoate threat. And the use of preemption was directed against that second category of problems. And I think that, in all honesty, it actually made the problem worse. I think the administration hoped that by preemptively invading Iraq, it would raise the potential cost of proliferation so high that North Korea and Iran wouldn't think of doing that. That may have happened in the case of Libya, but North Korea and Iran actually accelerated their nuclear programs once it was pretty clear that we were bogged down in Iraq, because for them, perfectly rationally, if you want to avoid being invaded by the United States and having your regime change, you get a nuclear weapon, and they're not going to do it to you. Right? So I think Iran's motive for wanting a nuclear weapon, despite all their protestations to the contrary, is pretty real, and it's also strategically, from their standpoint, pretty easy to understand why, if they can get away with it, they would want to try to do that. So we did not solve the non-proliferation problem in this manner, and I do not believe that as a general policy, preventive war can be used in this fashion. The third thing I think that we should have learned from the experience of the last few years is that you really need to deal with the proliferation problem, with the hearts and minds problem, with a whole series of foreign policy challenges in a much more multilateral way. And actually, at this point, it's not even worth kind of making the argument, because I think the Bush administration has pretty much agreed itself with this, because if you look at the way they've handled North Korea and Iran in the second 4 years, it's much more multilateral, working through the six-party talks on the Korean Peninsula, or working with the Europeans with regard to Iran. But it's important to understand what the fundamental problem was. And here, I think there's a history here that's important for people to keep in mind, because we have not solved the problem of collective action in dealing with important security challenges or even humanitarian operations yet. In the 1990s, the UN and the Europeans collectively failed to solve the problem in the Balkans. We have now, it's now like the 12th anniversary of Srebrenica and these other, horrible instances in which aggression in the Balkans was met very passively. UN peacekeepers were taken hostage, and that experience, I think, forms the backdrop for the Bush administration saying, okay, we're just not going to bother with these defective institutions that cannot provide either legitimacy or an effective basis for dealing with terrorism, human rights violations, refugees, any of the problems that the world faces in security terms. And they said, we're just going to lead, and we'll have other people follow us, and they will salute us when they see that we are acting effectively. And so they kind of went to the opposite extreme in terms of coalitions of the willing and the like. And they got into big trouble because, in fact, it was a couple of things. First of all, it turns out that the United States, given its own constraints, simply couldn't handle the problem all by itself. It could have used the legitimacy that the United Nations might have brought in the rebuilding of Iraq. In Afghanistan, we're desperately short of troops. We were heavily dependent on NATO allies to prevent the Taliban from taking over that country. But there is also this deeper problem that I think nobody adequately appreciated in the earlier part of the decade, which was that we are flying into this big headwind of anti-Americanism that I think is simply a structural feature of the world today. And it didn't begin with the Bush administration. You already saw this emerging in the Clinton years. And I think the reason is pretty straightforward. Because of the disproportionate influence that the United States has exercised militarily, culturally, economically, politically, it sets up this position of non-reciprocity. That is to say, we can overturn a regime 8,000 miles away basically without breaking a sweat, but other countries can't do the same thing to us. Or, you know, we make economic policy decisions that are very consequential to other countries in financial crisis, but the rest of the world, again, does not have a reciprocal degree of influence. And this really did start in economic issues in the Clinton administration, where many close American European allies greatly resented what they regarded as an American orchestrated globalization that they felt was designed to undermine their own welfare state and social protection mechanism. I mean, you know, the real story is more complicated than that, but that was a lot of the perception. And so you had already anti-globalization protests outside of American borders, with globalization seen as the cutting edge of American global hegemony. And I think all the Bush people did was they shifted that argument into the military security realm, where they ran into exactly that same kind of anti-Americanism. And that, I think, you know, the structural basis of that anti-Americanism is something that any future administration is going to have to take into account. And although, because it's structural, you know, as long as you're powerful, you're going to be resented. I think that the way you exercise that power at the margin can, you know, make a big difference with regard to how people are, how willing they're going to be to legitimate and what you do and to cooperate with you. The final component, or the final lesson I think we should have learned has to do with the role of democracy promotion and the idealistic agenda of American foreign policy. President Bush was not the first president to talk about democracy promotion. I mean, in a way it goes back to the founding of the American Republic, but certainly since Woodrow Wilson, this idealistic component has been part of the rhetoric of virtually every American administration, with, you know, one or two exceptions ever since then. But President Bush, in a sense, raised democracy promotion to a very different position in American foreign policy. If you go back to his second inaugural address that was given in January of 2005, he talked about democracy as the basis of American grand strategy. It wasn't about aircraft carriers or nuclear weapons or, you know, army divisions. It was all about, first of all, the lack of democracy, particularly in the Arab world, being the deep root cause for terrorism, and therefore the need to promote democracy in that part of the world as a means of getting at the underlying causes of everything that had happened since September 11th. Now, for reasons that I can't go into here, I think that that was in itself a wrong analysis, but this strong connection between democracy promotion and American strategic interests, I think, had a disastrous effect both for American foreign policy and for the cause of democracy around the world. It was not good for American foreign policy because it made us look hypocritical. You know, no sooner did that second inaugural get delivered, and Condi Rice, you know, made similar statements in Cairo and other Arab capitals, then you get the election of Hamas, the election of Mr. Ahmadinejad in Iran, the Muslim brothers doing well in Egypt, a whole series of Islamists using democratic elections to come to power. And what do you think? Well, the administration immediately backs off this emphasis on democracy, and it makes us look tremendously hypocritical. So if you go to the Middle East right now and you try to talk about American ideals of human rights, and this is coming on top of Guantanamo Bay and prisoner abuse and a lot of, I think, very unfortunate things that we've done in reaction to September 11th, people will just laugh at you. They will simply laugh at you, and they'll say, who the hell are you to be lecturing anybody in the world about this? Now, in all fairness, I think that that's also not a fair charge, but certainly that perception was very much fortified by this close union between strategic interest and democracy. Truth of the matter is, the United States is a great power. We've got interest in oil, in security, in anti-terrorism. We want to support allies. And it's never the case that democracy promotion will ever be the single most important goal that Americans ever pursue at the expense of those other things. But it's going to be a component, and so of course we're going to look hypocritical. But in some sense, by promoting democracy promotion, to that extent, you underline the hypocrisy, the inevitable and necessary hypocrisy when it's visible. It's also not good for the cause of actually promoting democracy on the ground. The administration is so unpopular, especially in the Middle East, that a lot of democratic groups there are simply not willing to take American money for fear of being tainted. Congress about 2 years ago appropriated about $75 million to support pro-democratic groups which exist in Iran, and not a penny of that money has been spent in Iran itself because it's simply way too dangerous for anyone to accept it. So this component of American foreign policy has been quite problematic. All right, so we've now begun talking about some of the changes that I think need to be made. Obviously, I think you need to talk about the threat quite differently. You need to change the conduct of the war of terrorism in ways that make it look much more like a global counterinsurgency or a police operation rather than an active war. We can talk about how you're going to get out of Iraq. I mean, I don't have a particularly good suggestion about that, but obviously that is something, winding that down is something that's going to happen in the next administration. But in terms of the Hearts and Minds campaign, there's another important component that is missing in our foreign policy and really needs to be there. My colleague at SAIS, Mike Mandelbaum, in the early 1990s wrote an article in Foreign Affairs with the title Foreign Policy as Social Work. This was when the Clinton administration was involved in Haiti and Somalia and getting involved in the Balkans. And he was quite actually contemptuous of this type of humanitarian intervention. And the thrust of his message was real foreign policy is about hard power, it's about traditional diplomacy, it's about dealing with other states. And I have to say that looking at this part of the world, I actually think that I would like to rewrite that article, but without the irony, because I actually do think that you need a little bit more social work in your foreign policy. If you look at the groups that are the most hostile to the United States, Hezbollah, Hamas, the people that voted for Ahmadinejad in Iran, or you come to this hemisphere, people that voted for Hugo Chavez in Venezuela or Evo Morales and other populists in Latin America. In many cases, the basis for their support of these leaders is actually not foreign policy or anti-Americanism. It is because all of these groups have social agendas. And in the case of virtually all of them, their political parties are busy directly delivering social services like schools, clinics, other kinds of social needs. And one of the big problems in American foreign policy is that component that appeals to poorer populations in developing countries has been really missing from our rhetoric and from the panoply of things that we have to offer the rest of the world. Our foreign policy has been largely built on democracy promotion and free trade as an engine to economic growth. There's nothing wrong with that agenda. I believe that those are, in fact, good things in themselves, and they go together, and they fit with American values and so forth, but they really do not appeal in many countries to poor and excluded people. They tend to appeal more to better educated middle classes. And one of the reasons that the United States has been losing influence in the Andean part of, in all of Latin America, but particularly in the Andean countries, is that we have simply not been seen as offering anything in the social realm or anything to deal directly with problems of poverty or social exclusion. And so I think as we go forward, one of the issues that we are going to have to address is how you can actually do that in a way, given what the American government is and what it is and is not capable of. The final really big issue, it's more of an inside the beltway kind of thing, but it's really important, is implementation. One of the really distressing things about the way that the American government has worked over the past 7 years is just the sheer level of incompetence at actually administering policies. So you invade Iraq, but you don't plan for the aftermath. You're actually in a counterinsurgency war, but the military doesn't admit this for 2 or 3 years. You actually go through the two really big reorganizations of the federal government, of the intelligence community, and of Homeland Security. And as far as I can tell, both of those reorganizations have actually made things worse rather than better. But Hurricane Katrina, there's a lot of cases where even when we are agreed on what we want to do in our policy, somehow our bureaucracies and our agencies are not able to actually deliver the goods. And this is something where, again, in thinking about the hearts and minds part of the campaign, we really need to think about how to strengthen the soft power dimensions or the soft power instruments that we have available to us. The funding part of it is actually good, and the one area where the administration doesn't get nearly enough credit is actually in things like foreign aid, PEPFAR, the President's emergency plan for AIDS relief, or the Millennium Challenge Corporation, or general levels of spending on foreign assistance have gone way, way up in this administration. So the problem is not resources. The problem is that our current institutional structure is really not good at delivering, in translating those dollars into real results on the ground. Just to take a couple of examples, coordination of nation building was a disaster in Iraq. It was a lesser disaster in Afghanistan, but it also wasn't a pretty sight there. There were some efforts to create an office of a special coordinator to deal with this in the State Department. It didn't get funded, and now what's happening is the Pentagon is basically taking over all these civilian kinds of functions, and that's not, I think, an ideal setup. We've gone through, in fact, Steve Krasner was very much involved in this so-called F process to reorganize the foreign assistance account, and that has also not, unfortunately, not worked terribly well. And what it's meant is you get a lot of micromanagement of that money from Washington, and that's something that's going to have to be unwound and completely redone in the next administration. Okay, I'm running a little bit late, so I'm going to have to give Asia a little bit of a short shrift. I'm going to switch our attention to another part of the world, because I think that actually the bigger set of issues, while we've been preoccupied with terrorism in the Middle East, you've got this really big set of issues in East Asia that have to do with the rise of China and how you think about it and how you deal with it. Because China is going to, I'm not convinced that Osama bin Laden and his friends are going to be around in 25 years. But believe me, China is going to be there, and they're going to be a lot more powerful, and so will India, and so will a lot of other growing powers in that part of the world. Now, if you look at the history of rising powers, it doesn't give you a lot of confidence, because there are plenty of cases where the international system has not dealt well with new powers. A classic case of this was Germany after 1870, after German unification, where the mishandling of the emergence of this new very large power in the center of Europe by England and France basically set the stage for the First World War. The only case where there's been a graceful accommodation of a rising power that I can think of was actually Britain accommodating the rise of the United States as the U.S. in the 20th century emerged as a major global naval power, and we pretty much peacefully displaced Britain in that role. But there are a lot of cultural and other reasons why that was a relatively easy accommodation, and these things don't often go very well. We have been hoping that the problem will be solved by China becoming a democracy, because there's an argument supported by a certain amount of data that democracies don't fight one another, and that the real problem with China is the fact that it's run by an authoritarian communist party. The larger question of whether democracies fight each other we can argue about separately, but I think that there's actually very little chance that in the short run, meaning in the next 10 to 15 years, that China will democratize. And the argument is actually pretty straightforward. A lot of times people have said that economic development brings pressure for democratization because you have a new rising middle class that owns property and therefore wants a share of political power in order to get the government to protect that new wealth and those new property rights. That, I think, is a decent argument if the vast majority of your citizens actually consider themselves to be middle class and do own property. But the problem with China is that its development has become very uneven. Its Gini coefficient, the measure of inequality, has gone up by about 10 points over the last 20 years. The top 10% in China earn something like 19 times that of the bottom 10%. And so what you have is maybe 200-300 million people that have benefited tremendously from China's modernization, but an awful lot of people left in the countryside that have been left behind by China's rapid economic growth. And everything that I have seen suggests that none of those new elites in China really wants democracy in the short run, because they know that it's going to unleash all of these pent-up demands for redistribution, and they are not going to be able to protect their gains under that situation. Now, when China becomes a much richer country, and instead of 2/3 of the country still being left in the countryside, it's down to like 20% or so, which is more like where South Korea and Taiwan were in the 1980s when they democratized, then I actually think that there will be pressure for democracy. China actually may be the first country that democratizes because of environmental concerns. China is poisoning itself. It's like an early stage capitalist country where developers and companies and local governments, are all colluding to deprive people of property and violating the country's own labor and environmental laws. And I think ultimately the only way that you solve these kinds of issues politically is actually by having more democratic participation from the grassroots. But I think this is a development that will not solve the foreign policy problem of a rising China, for a good generation or so. So it's still going to be an issue. In Asia, I think the basic choices really have to do with the kind of institutional security architecture that is put in place. It's interesting that in contrast to the period right after 1945, where all of the wise men of American post-war policy, guys like Dean Acheson and George Kennan, all of them thought in institutional terms, and their most enduring legacy were things like the Bretton Woods institutions, NATO, the United Nations, the U.S.-Japan Security Alliance. All of these institutions are still in place more than 50 years later, and they still structure the way that countries interact. And there has, apart from the WTO, there's been very little top-level institutional creativity exercised, and certainly in this administration, although I would say that their Asia policy probably gets maybe a B+ or a B or so, it's also been just extremely pragmatic and not architectural. It hasn't been thinking about longer-term institutions. And in the case of managing China, I think that that's important. The real issue that everybody would like to know right now is, as China gets more powerful and as it commands a greater and greater share of global GDP, are its ambitions going to expand, or is it the case that it will, in some sense, become a stakeholder in international institutions and modify its own objectives and so forth? I mean, this is a great hope of liberal internationalism. And I think that people come at this problem with preconceived notions. They're either realists or they're liberal internationalists, and so they kind of assume an answer. And I would say that it's going to be hard to tell. It would be hard to imagine China not having greater ambitions once they become very powerful. But it's also the case that one of the reasons that people accept international rules is that it is in their self-interest in doing this. And right now, China is all over sub-Saharan Africa. They're all over Latin America in search of energy, in search of commodities, raw materials. They're digging up, a lot of the developing world in Western Australia and all shipping it, to ports in China, under basically a fairly cynical principle of respect for everyone's sovereignty, so that basically you just, you don't complain about the way anyone governs their own people, you just do business with them. And what they're finding is that they're getting a lot of pushback. I mean, you've of course had this thing with the Olympic torch, but I think in more ways that are also quite important, when you put in a energy project that then generates local backlash and guerrillas shooting at your workers and things of that sort, as has happened with the Chinese energy investment in Sudan, then you think, well, maybe a more politically sensitive approach to these problems might be in order. And so therefore, I think that there needs to be in Asia careful attention to thinking through whether there are institutional arrangements for making sure that nationalism between Japan, China, and Korea, among other things, does not get out of hand, channels of communication, institutionalized ways of doing business in terms of investment and trade. On that front, there are institutions. I mean, it's much more institutionalized in the economic than it is in the security realm. But this is a place where this is the time to do it if you're going to do it. The time when it's not going to work is when China is as powerful as the United States. You have some chance, if you get Chinese buy-in to all of this at a time when they're relatively weaker and the United States is relatively stronger, that you develop certain habits of interacting in certain channels of communication and the like. So unfortunately, this is not a, there are other parts of the world that we've not touched on, Africa, development, Latin America, and so forth. Unfortunately, everybody wants to come up with a grand overarching strategy like containment to deal with the next generation of problems in foreign policy. And that's, I think, a fundamental mistake, because, in fact, you then try to cram all of the existing cases as lesser included cases of your big paradigm. And first of all, your big paradigm may be wrong, but secondly, almost none of the lesser cases are actually included ones. They're actually separate things that need separate policies to deal with. But I think that's kind of the lay of the land, and that is the agenda that I would think whoever occupies the White House in next January is going to need to think through. So thank you very much for your attention.
President Fukuyama has agreed to answer some questions, so we can open up the floor. Please keep your questions brief.
I would like first to comment on the statement in the program by Director Onyadi Center, where he said decision made by the international community in the coming years will have significant impact on us. Well, I really would like you to add more that so far the United States is the one doing the most impact on the world, not the other way around. Though we are concerned about this, and as the speaker said, clearly the United States impact on the world, not the other way around. My question is the following. The Bush policy, which really is, I understand you have to call it Bush policy, it's really the policy of Cheney, Wolfowitz, Pearl, including yourself, that formulated the overall framework for that policy, is clearly a failure, and you said that yourself. Now, you have not really two things I want to comment on. The first, in all this discussion and speech, you have not mentioned a word, one word, about the impact of this strategy and policy on the miserable situation of the people on land, whether millions of Iraqis or so many hundreds of thousands of deaths, etc. Please do mention that, to give some humanity to your presentation. My question, you have, according to your title, you're giving us American foreign policy after, but you really have not given any. Assume that you are the Condoleezza Rice and Cheney of the next president. What specific you're going to do in January, you recommend, especially for the Middle East? Be specific. You have to be specific because we're living in a real world.
Well, with all due respect, I thought I had answered a lot of those issues. I mean, look, in terms of expressing sympathy for people that have been harmed by decisions that the United States made, I mean, I think that, I didn't think I had to state that explicitly, because I would say that when you call something a big failure, you kind of take that for granted, and that's something, that Americans need to consider, that when they act, and if they are not wise in those actions, or they make mistakes, it's, a political black eye for the people that made the decision, but it's personally, means the loss of your life or livelihood or a lot of other things for the, the people on the ground, as you say. So, I appreciate that, and I think that is a good point. Just to repeat what I said, first of all, I would run the war on terrorism much, much differently, which is to say I'd stop calling it a war. I think that you need to get out of Iraq, because as long as you're occupying a major Arab capital, you are not going to ultimately get at a lot of the sources of, of recruitment into these groups. They have already, under this administration, re-engaged on the Palestinian issue. It was a tremendous mistake not to have done that earlier. I'm, having worked on that issue when I was in the State Department in the 1980s, I'm not really confident, how much progress can be made, but, certainly you need to try. Since I was trying to cover the whole world, it's a little bit hard to simply list specific policies for every country, but I'll just give you, one example of an adjustment. I believe that, that I actually fear that the United States, as a result of Iraq, is going to go back to a Kissinger-like realism where people are going to say, well, the hell with all these countries, as long as they're not shooting at us, we're just going to pretty much ignore them and not worry about things like democracy. And I think that is a big mistake. And so that has to be part of the agenda. I think it's achieved with soft power rather than with hard power. But it's funny that the Bush administration didn't even follow through on its own wisdom in a country, for example, like Pakistan. So in that country, we have put all of our eggs in Musharraf's basket. I think we would have done much better actually to let democratic processes work there, because Pakistan, is actually a country, where you get lawyers, these guys in these black suits that go out on the streets, and face down the police to defend the rule of law. And so, you have people that are serious about sharing a lot of American values. The Islamist Party in the Northwest Frontier, actually in the February election, did pretty badly when they were allowed to come to power and people saw that they couldn't govern. And so I think that if the president had followed the instinct, to a certain extent in that second inaugural, and actually let some of these democratic processes play through and accept some of the results, because they represent important sectors of each of these societies, I think that our policy would have been better anchored. So we can pick a lot of countries where I could be much more specific. I was just trying to lay out some general principles about how I think you need to make adjustments. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
I was wondering if you could speak about Barack Obama's concept of dignity promotion, because it does sound at least abstractly similar to what you're saying. And what is the over-under on the type of social work you're raising? For example, does a continuation of the Bush Doctrine on hard power, which is basically what John McCain himself has said he's offering, can that be mitigated or ameliorated by the type of social reform policy you're advocating? Does it balance out? Or as a precondition, do you have to disengage from military engagements like Iraq? Because if I'm reading you right, it wouldn't sound like you could support a McCain foreign policy to balance out. It would seem like you have to get out of Iraq and do the other things you're calling for.
It all depends on the specific country and region and so forth. So I think that in the Persian Gulf, it's pretty hard to get things back to kind of stable equilibrium until the United States is out of Iraq. But that doesn't, win you very much in Venezuela or in Ecuador or in parts of Latin America. Whereas having a set of soft power instruments that could actually meet some of the needs of, let's say, indigenous peoples in rural areas in Bolivia or Ecuador actually could win you something. And actually, again, to give him credit, in the last time the president was down there, it was the first time in his administration he's actually used the word poverty, and said and inequality, and talking about those as things that are of concern to the United States, right? So I think that, again, you have to have a policy that's very much tailored to the specific conditions of the part of the world in which you are operating. And actually, the degree to which all of these things are tied together can sometimes be exaggerated. So, you can still make progress, whatever progress you can make, for example, on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, you're going to make, I think, in a way that's separate from exactly what's going on in Iraq and what the American force level is there and so forth. Okay, let's see. How about, sir? Yeah. Okay.
A couple of quick questions. The first is when you talk about democracy should have been pursued in Pakistan. It almost sounds to me like you're saying, well, in Pakistan, Benazir Bhutto would have won, and that's effectively a U.S. ally, so democracy is good there. But in Venezuela and in Gaza, democracy is not such a good idea because it produces the wrong result. You think that, it may be simple-minded, but you really think that the idea of promoting democracy was as an institution, or was it because there was a blind faith that democracy would, in fact, produce results like Benazir Bhutto and not produce results like Hamas?
Yeah.
That's the first thing I want to ask. And the second was, when you talk about the failure of, or the non-utility of hard force in the present world, and the fact that it doesn't work with non-strong state actors, I was thinking about that while you were talking, and I thought, well, is it that we're not tough enough? That, the Gestapo did a pretty good job of maintaining of getting rid of their enemies in occupied Europe, and Israel, who seems to be more or less concentrating on hard power, meaning assassinations and keeping down the possibilities of the Palestinians harming them, they have been able to create a certain sense of security for a long time. So why can't we do things like that? Is it our innate goodness that doesn't let us do it, or does it really not?
First of all, on the question of elections, it is the case that there are a lot of circumstances in which early elections are actually not good for the country, and there are certainly a lot of cases where they wouldn't be good from the standpoint of American foreign policy. So right now, if you had an election, a free and fair election in Saudi Arabia, I don't know what would come out of the end of it, but it probably wouldn't be better than what we've got now. And so, pushing for that in the short, it's not much of an issue there anyhow, but, pushing for that I would not think would be, all that great a possibility. But I think that part of the reality that makes this part of the world so hard to govern is that you've had on the ground, the mobilization of a lot of new social actors. You know, Sam Huntington talked about this as one of the reasons that political development is hard, is that you get all these people mobilized and then they're not accommodated into the existing political structure. But I think that the elections are actually just a symptom of that mobilization. I mean, I wish that all these people in Gaza hadn't voted for Hamas, but the reason that they did that is that they have, you know, a lot of frustrations and you know, they feel a certain way towards Israel. And if you don't have the election and they don't get elected, that's not going to change their feelings, and it's not going to, you know, it's not going to somehow shape the views of Palestinians or mean that they're more willing to make peace with Israel. So in some sense, the elections are simply kind of measures or you know, they're symptoms of the underlying you know, changes that are going on in these societies. And that's why I think you actually have to be a little bit more forward-leaning, and you're willing to accept the fact that, you know, this group is now electing people and they don't like you, but you got to figure out, you know, how to, you know, work them into a political system rather than having them shoot their way into power, which is really the alternative that that most of them would take. Yeah, and I think the answer on your second one, I mean, I think you answered your own question. Yeah, we could behave, well, even the Gestapo, you know, in the end, you know, I mean, you had a couple of efforts to do that. You know, the Soviet Union was another one in which Stalin was willing to murder, you know, literally tens of millions of people in order to achieve power, and that system crumbled, you know, shortly after he died, because people didn't want to live under that repressive system. So even if the United States were that kind of country, I don't think it would work, but we're not that, you know, fortunately we're not that kind of country, and we have to accept the fact that we, you know, stand for certain ideals, and we're not going to, you know, be ruthless in our exercise of, you know, that kind of power. Yes, at the back.
I hear two things that are like the one that I'll take with me forever from here, and one is soft politics and the other one is social work. But I try to mix like us and you into the puzzle, and I have a question for you on regard to that. What can we do and what are you doing to change the mindsetting to make the American politics and the common administration, but also the society, to push this interest to make the social impact on the developing countries and in the needed places? And not just here, but from the Chinese. You said they're looking for resources everywhere, like Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. But how can they cluster that agenda with social work? They are doing it, and the European Union is doing it in the Eastern Europe, but the Americans are not so successful yet with the resources search, even in Brazil and all these new petroleum, to force their mindset to also give something back with the social work. I point an example. I've been trying to seduce Dr. Scorton to give this soft politic push with the universities and to bring virtual universities to all these developing places. And they say, no, because there is no research or there is no profit. But until they, you know, even the academia thinks that there is a bigger responsibility in the soft politics, I just think that the profit vision, how can we squish it?
Well, not quite sure where to begin in answering that. First of all, I actually don't think you're giving enough credit to the United States as a society in terms of what it is doing. Now, I would be the first to admit that our official aid programs leave a lot to be desired. USAID has right from the start been a very troubled agency, low morale, encumbered by all sorts of political constraints in the way that it operates, encumbered by a kind of dysfunctional bureaucratic culture. They're basically now a big contracting agency, and you know, they don't have, you know, any of the core capacities to really deliver the kinds of social services you know, that I'm talking about. So if you're actually going to try to fix that component of American soft power, you've got to think about certain institutional changes in the whole structure of that, you know, that side of it. But you know, the other thing that I think you're not giving adequate credit to is that Americans are involved in a whole lot of things in developing countries that are not given through official aid channels. I mean, I run in my school an international development program. Probably 2/3 of the people that graduate from that program are going to go out into the field in a developing country and work in an NGO or with a multilateral institution or some other kind of development agency trying to deliver exactly these sorts of services. And if you go to Africa, you know, like 10% of the GDP of sub-Saharan Africa as a whole comes out of these donor, from these both official and unofficial donors. Now, it's another question whether this is actually doing any good, because you can also argue that, you know, actually giving all those resources, you know, undermines governance and a lot of other things. But it's not for want of trying. So in terms of that, I think that as a matter of public policy, the parts that are potentially the most fixable have to do with the actual mechanisms by which we deliver development assistance. And unfortunately, that particular issue is always like item number 32 in the agenda of any new president, you know, in what they're going to accomplish in the first 100 days. This is not going to be up at the top, and so it generally gets left until, you know, later part of the administration when they've already blown all their political capital on other things, and they're now looking around for something else to do so that they can claim some area of achievement. And I hope it doesn't happen that way. Yeah.
Thank you. In your second part of the talk,
yeah,
it seems that this is a somehow more important part because the first part basically is a failure. And the second part we are talking about, we are now at a moment of historical opportunity to set a new agenda in East Asia, with dealing with China challenge as a kind of central aim. And there's 2 points that are particularly interesting, I noticed. One, you mentioned that China probably will become the first country to become democratic because of environmental pressure. That's something extremely interesting. Because you're absolutely right, China is a country with tremendous environmental challenges. And compared with the United States, you know, China was such a resource positive country. So what is your logic? Because it could be that environmental pressure will force China to become less positive toward a path toward democracy. You know, because how to concentrate, you know, administrative and all kinds of power and resources toward making the society's orderly development is really when with environmental, you know, issue. And the second, you mentioned that this is time to try to come up with some kind of institutional design. And that's, again, extremely interesting. Do you mean that this institutional design should try to institutionalize China's being increasingly an insider of the international system? If that was the case, what kind of specific design do you have in your mind?
Okay. Well, look, I'm not an expert on China, and you should probably be telling me the answer to your own questions. But with regard to the first one, this is my understanding of what China's political problem is, that the real problem in China is not at the central government level in Beijing. The big problem are all of these township and village enterprises, these, you know, local government bodies that were the mechanism that the regime used to promote the early phases of the modernization. They've all grown extremely rich and very powerful. A lot of them are in cahoots with developers, and, you know, these are the people that are dispossessing peasants of their land and provoking all of these, you know, violent incidents in response. They're the ones that are dumping all this bad stuff into rivers and into the air and so forth. And actually, the big problem that the Chinese central government has is that they are not strong enough to actually clamp down on these local political bodies and make them obey rules that are actually on the books in terms of Chinese law. And so, so my perception is that they're kind of riding this tiger and they're trying to figure out, how to get control down at this, this grassroots level with all of these people that are doing things that are provoking. I mean, I don't know if I mentioned this little factoid, but last year there's something like 4,000 violent, reported incidents of violent protest in China as a result of people in local communities suffering from, this kind of exploitation. And the reason that I think that democracy figures into this is that I don't think that you can solve this kind of problem in a top-down fashion. There's never going to be a system by which the government is going to be so administratively powerful that it can pull all of these local government bodies into line. I think that that has to come as a result of greater political participation. And so therefore, on a grassroots level, all of these people that are suffering under this current system, are going to have to be formally cut in. Now, on the second question, it just so happens that I have just published a new book on this subject about East Asian multilateralism that in fact just came out this past week. And if you actually want to get a lot more specific suggestions about specific institutions, you can look in that book. And yes, basically, the big design question is, what a lot of conservatives would like to do is they say, okay, here's China rising, so we need to build a containment barrier around China in the way that we did around the former Soviet Union. And that was, part of what motivated a lot of the revitalization of a lot of bilateral American defense commitments to India, Japan, Mongolia, and so forth. But the other way that I favor at this point more is a set of institutions that include China and give them a stake in an existing institutional order in East Asia. Now, one that I wrote about, not only in this book, but I wrote this in Foreign Affairs 2-3 years ago, is, you've stumbled into this six-party framework for dealing with North Korean nuclear weapons. Why not convert that into a permanent OSCE-type Northeast Asia security forum among Japan, China, Korea, Russia, and if you think about, you just take a practical problem. North Korean regime collapses, and all of a sudden there's this big vacuum, and the country has to be rebuilt. That is going to be the source of huge tensions between South Korea and all of its, neighbors, particularly Japan, but also the United States and Russia, China. If you had a forum by which you could talk about this stuff ahead of time, I think you could handle that transition much more effectively. And then there's, the Asians are really good at producing all of these multilateral organizations that don't seem to actually do anything, like, APEC and ASEAN and, ASEAN +3. But I think that, actually in that group, there are some that could be used and given a greater security role. The economic stuff is happening by itself. After the Asian crisis, you had the Chiang Mai initiative and other things. But so there is actually a much more detailed agenda that I've got if you actually have the patience to work through that. Yes, on this side. Yeah.
Every administration seems to have different aspects of it which it relies on heavily for foreign policy advice, whether it's Secretary of State or Vice President of the NSA. How can the next president build their cabinet or build a group around them where they get a balanced amount of advice? And
Well, the structure is there to do that, right? The National Security Advisor is supposed to be a neutral arbiter between all of the cabinet agencies, and what the National Security Advisor is supposed to do is to actually give the president a range of opinions. And I think the thing that will be held against Condi Rice in future history is that she didn't do that. She didn't do that adequately in the lead up to the Iraq War. The other important institutional player that could play that role is the vice president, because the vice president, could be the one that steps back and sees the role of that office as protecting the presidency itself, including protecting the presidency against, bad advice, from the cabinet. And then, obviously, in this administration, you had a very powerful vice president that leapt into the policy debate with very strong ideas of his own as to what the proper outcome could be. I have frequently thought, though, that this problem is an insoluble one. It's really funny. I mean, talking about coming back, to Cornell and repeating some of the mistakes of Vietnam. I mean, I think that during the Vietnam War, there were these ideas about the imperial presidency and groupthink. And I remember when I, read about this stuff in graduate school, I thought, that's stupid. People don't actually think like that, and you get much broader advice and so forth. But you've actually seen this in play. Not just in this administration, but I think in a lot of administrations. So the groupthink, you have this bureaucratic tribalism in which the alternative policies are there, people are articulating them, but you simply don't want to listen to them because it's being articulated by the other tribe. And this is something that's very hard to appreciate unless you've actually worked in a bureaucracy in Washington. Your loyalty to your bureaucratic tribe trumps all other loyalties. And you don't want to be seen as violating that. And it's a psychological phenomenon, and I'm just not sure that there's a kind of institutional solution to that. The imperial presidency part of it is the following: that the office of the president is so powerful that even with the best of intentions, it is really hard to create a presidential office that is not full of sycophants, basically, that want to, they want the president to do something, and therefore they're going to tell the president whatever they. And in fact, Zbig Brzezinski, who was Carter's national security advisor, told me his office is just down the hall from mine. So he was saying once that, even Jimmy Carter, who was the most mild-mannered, humble president when he came into office, that Brzezinski was saying that in the first year of the Carter administration, he could go into the president's office and say, Mr. President, I think this is wrong, you should consider an alternative policy or criticize something the president said. He said by the fourth year of the Carter administration, you couldn't do that because everybody just expected, you'd be deferential to the president. The president didn't want to hear, someone with really strong opposing views. And as I said, this is Jimmy Carter, this is Mr. Nice Guy. It wasn't, hard-charging George W. So again, I'm just not sure what the solution to either of those problems is, because I don't think you can fix this just by moving around the organizational boxes in the in the office of in the executive office.
Perhaps one more question.
Okay. Yes.
You mentioned that when you're coming back to Cornell after 37 years, you didn't see the armed student protest. You think this is a progress? But
I didn't see weapons. That's what I. Yeah.
But I think this is not the case. I wonder, how do you think about the ending of the draft system after the Vietnam War?
Yeah.
Because as Machiavelli said, the militia is very important for the public. So the draft system, I think, is more than equivalent to the militia. So without draft, in a sense that you mentioned the State Department of Canada do not have a well-perceived plan. But I ask why? Because they are not under pressure. They lack the democratic accountability.
Yeah.
So I wonder, do you comment?
No, I think that there is the political pressures that led Nixon to create a volunteer army were understandable, but I think under ideal circumstances it would be better to have the draft back, make everybody subject to it, and no college exemptions. I got a college deferment when I was at Cornell, so I didn't serve in the U.S. military, but I think it would actually be better to have everybody serve, including the children of all the elite decision makers that make decisions on whether to go to war. Because if you're going to do it, you ought to do it as a nation and as a community, and share in in a lot of those risks. But and I think there are a lot of people I think that are actually quite worried about U.S. civil-military relations, because for vast number of American elites, they're never going to meet someone in the military. Their families, don't have people serving. The families that do serve, it's a tradition in their families. They live in certain parts of the country. South is way overrepresented in kind of red state America, and it just means that there is a real difference in worldview between the country and its military, and that's not a healthy That's not a healthy situation. And you're right, I suspect that that's why they're not armed students. If you're all being drafted to go to Iraq, I think you'd probably worry about it a little bit more. So.